All right, let's kick off. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here with us today. As Sangeeta noted, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box if you feel comfortable and safe doing so. Today, we are really excited to be here with you to discuss two recently published reports from RUSI that lay out how authoritarian governments around the world abuse the FATF recommendations to target civil society groups, and importantly, for us to be able to have a conversation about what civil society can do to protect themselves. So a few quick logistics and ways that we're going to operate this webinar on our end. Please feel free throughout the discussion today to submit either via the Q&A function or raise your hand for any questions. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the session, but if you want to submit in the Q&A function, we can gather those and then get to the questions at the end. Otherwise, feel free to raise your hand when we get to that part of the session. We are going to record the session for the conversation with Miguel and Stephen and Azru today. But once we get to the Q&A, we will stop recording so that folks feel safe and secure to be able to freely ask questions. So that's how we will operate in terms of recording. So I want to just introduce all of our FATF policy experts with us today. So we have Azru, Abbasova, and Stephen Reimer, who will share their research and findings with us. And then the discussion will be moderated by our very own from the Global NPO Coalition on FATF, Miguel de la Vega, also a FATF policy expert. And Miguel really brings expertise both from a domestic, regional, and global perspective. So happy to have everyone here with us. So without further ado, Miguel, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And welcome to this space where we were going to talk about this report, the Weaponisation of FATF Standards, a guide for global civil society, and the accompanying policy brief, Suppression Laundering, using FATF as a fig leaf to target civil society as well. This is a key issue for civil society globally. On her report in 2023, the special rapporteur on the subject of human rights and counterterrorism appointed the restrictions that came out of counterterrorism and securitization agenda as probably one, if not the major threat that's been using from governments around the world to tackle civil society. It's a major threat to democracy, and unfortunately, is inspired on recommendations by FATF that were intended to combat terrorism and money laundering. Nevertheless, they have been turned into a weapon against not only civil society, against, let's say, many critics, people that the regimes in authoritarian governments, or not so authoritarian as well, sometimes even in democracies, they are seen as uncomfortable, they are seen as a menace to the establishment. So this is a very relevant subject, and I welcome Stephen Reimer and Abbasova to join us today. We're going to start with a presentation by Stephen, and also feel free to comment as well, please, and welcome as well. And then we'll have an extensive question and answer stage. But initially, we'll just mention a couple of cases that are a good example of this in Latin America after Stephen's presentation. So welcome, everyone, and please, Stephen, go ahead. The floor is yours, and let's start.
Thanks, Miguel. And thank you to the NPO Coalition on FATF for welcoming Azru and I from RUSI to present this research. Azru and I have spent quite a bit of time over the last 2 years thinking about misuses of the FATF standards against all different types of members of civil society by all different types of governments, not just authoritarian governments. We settled on the title of Suppression Laundering because we felt that this did a good job of trying to describe the phenomena at its most basic form. Really, the FATF system and the compliance aspects of it that are expected of financial institutions and governments has been used as a pretense, we've seen across the world, for suppressing different types of dissidents. Effectively, suppression that would have occurred anyway on these types of actors and individuals is effectively laundered by appealing to FATF as a pretense. And the main sort of point that I think will be most interesting for this audience about this work is that it's a lot more than just FATF's recommendation 8. It's really the whole system that's coming to bear on civil society in a critical way. We probably are all familiar with the unintended consequences project of the FATF, but we can cast our minds back all the way back to October of 2021, when we got that high-level synopsis of what FATF found to be the unintended consequences of its own standards. But in that document, there was this quotation in reference to the 4th pillar of the project on human rights, which subsequently was dropped from the follow-up that FATF agreed to do on its own project. But this caught our eye right from the beginning. Concern about FATF standards potentially used as an excuse measure with other motivations. So we can read into the subtext there that even in 2021, FATF itself recognized this risk that its standards could be used in all kinds of nefarious ways. So based on that, Arzu and I and the Center for Finance and Security at RUSI undertook this research, this fact-finding project to achieve a couple of aims. But in terms of how we did our research, we started by looking at 126 different cases of this type of abuse, and those came from 34 different jurisdictions around the world. We supplemented that with interviews from experts and survivor victims of this type of abuse, and as is good practice, checked our findings in a couple different engagements to contextualize in different environments, because we really were trying to do a global study, which is challenging. Essentially, what we were trying to do was gather as many different cases of misuse and abuse as we could, because really these anecdotes are really scattered around the globe in various different contexts, and they're not really speaking to one another, typically because victim survivors aren't aware that what's happening to them is really part of a broader trend. So we wanted to bring those cases together and try to distill what are the most common tactics of misuse of the FATF standards and assemble those into what we call a common playbook of the tactics used. And by doing this, we wanted to, as a defense and security think tank, to prepare an impartial evidence base, something that we could hand to civil society members themselves to raise their own awareness of this type of abuse, but crucially, to inform their own advocacy operations. It's not RUSI's job to do this type of national level or international level advocacy. We are a research organization, but we wanted to provide this to folks who are in a better position to undertake that advocacy. Ultimately, we argued to try and preserve the sanctity of the FATF standards. We don't want to throw bricks at FATF endlessly. We think it's an important organization. It's trying to do good work to preserve the integrity of the global financial system. These types of abuse besmirch that reputation. It besmirches and impedes the FATF's ability to do what it wants to do. So in addition to protecting civil society, supporting them, we also want to protect and preserve the FATF, albeit probably in a different format than it is today. So I want to go through some of the very top-level findings from our research. And the first top-level finding, which I already previewed, is that this problem has to do with way more than just not-for-profit organizations. Yes, 50% of the cases we looked at involved weaponization of the FATF standards, targeting not-for-profits and other NGOs, those that maybe don't have the FATF definition of NPO, but are still a non-governmental organization broadly. But that left a 50% of our sample that had other types of identities. And that included 14% of our cases, which were political opposition figures. So just individuals who had prominent position as opposition leaders in their country. 15% of our cases were journalists and members of the media, which are not included under the FATF definition of NPO. 19% of our cases involved what we called activists and campaigners. This was, again, several individuals who were not themselves a not-for-profit organization, but were obviously government critics in their own right. And this category also includes protest movements, which, again, are not-for-profit organizations. They're more organized representations of public discontent, but not a not-for-profit organization in its own right. And finally, we had 2% of our cases of what we called independent business people. I don't want to sort of go too far into who these guys are because they were just 2% of our sample. But we came across several cases whereby members of independent businesses were refusing authoritarian governments' attempts to control their business or to effectively prevent them from being able to carry out their business activities. And again, FATF standards and the powers and regulations that are underpinned by the FATF standards were used to silence and to silence these types of actors as well. So it's a broad spectrum of potential victims. And further, it's more than just a terrorism financing problem. So the vast majority of our cases did involve misuse of FATF's counterterrorism financing powers and standards, but almost a quarter were also involved with money laundering standards and regulations. But the further 3% of cases involving some type of interesting combination of language, such as laundering the proceeds of terrorist acts. I don't know how acts of terrorism raise funds, which then can then be laundered, but there was at least one case where a civil society actor was targeted using this type of FATF language. This chart is maybe the most important in the whole presentation. I know there's lots of text here, but really what we're trying to show here is that we identified 4 different groups of FATF standards that give rise to the types of laws and powers that we identified as being those most common to be misused by ill-intentioned states. And you can see none of them are FATF's recommendation 8. The 4 groups include recommendations 29 and 31. So this is the first group that really has to do with what FATF instructs states to do in relation to establishing financial intelligence units and crucially collecting and sharing financial intelligence in itself. The second group is recommendations 3 and 5 of the FATF standards, which are those core recommendations that just criminalize money laundering and terrorism financing. And we saw in various cases politically motivated convictions and in cases investigations into civil society actors based on bogus terrorism financing and money laundering charges. The third group, recommendation 4, is what underpins a lot of countries' asset freezing powers and asset recovery powers as well. When those asset freezing powers become weaponized, FATF recommendation 4 is the FATF aspect that comes to be misused. And finally, recommendations 37 through 39 are the FATF's outline of how states should engage in international cooperation to tackle money laundering and terrorism financing. And in those types of information exchange tools like mutual legal assistance requests and even extradition treaties, we saw some misuse of FATF standards, misuse of money laundering and terrorism financing as well. This is the playbook of the tactics that we were able to distill from those 126 cases. There's 5 major tactics that states use to weaponize the FATF standards. We saw these types of cases used across the globe, while there was some degree of contextual clustering or geographical clustering. All 5 cases were seen all around the world, which I think speaks to the fact that this is truly a global problem stemming from something as globally applicable as the FATF standards. So let me just quickly go through each of them in turn to explain a little bit more what these tactics were. So the first is what we call intelligence fishing and scraping. This is primarily misuse of the FATF standards related to sharing financial intelligence and the powers of a financial intelligence unit. We saw several cases whereby the financial intelligence units of particular countries were what we call procedurally captured by other organs of the state, and the financial intelligence collection capabilities of FIUs was directed against political opponents and some of those targets of the authoritarian abuses as we spoke about. Cases whereby maybe it's the police or the office of the public prosecutor, or maybe folks even higher up in a state, directing the FIU to require financial institutions to hand over bank account information about particular targets. Sometimes using that information to fabricate a criminal charge, but sometimes just using that as a means of keeping tabs on what an organization or individual is up to in terms of what they're spending money on, what their financial position is, a type of financial surveillance of potential targets, if you will. The second tactic is what we ended up calling strategic bank account freezing. Essentially, anywhere where the administrative powers of bank account freezing that a state has were being used as a punitive tool to go after particular dissidents and opponents. The FATF's asset freezing recommendation and the powers that's underpinned by it are really important because they're meant to prevent capital flight. If you have somebody who is suspected of money laundering, you need to freeze their accounts so that the illicit funds remain in their account, and that can support investigations. But when this is misused, asset freezing powers can be used to freeze the bank accounts of an individual or an organization for a prolonged period of time. What we saw that was really concerning around strategic bank account freezing were cases where individuals or groups are initiating their right for judicial review or exemptions to their asset freezes, but a lot of those requests just being flatly ignored by different countries, sometimes for clerical reasons. Third, we have harassment and prosecution of different types of organizations. This is what looked the most like what we've seen in terms of Recommendation 8 related suppression of different civil society organizations, but it typically manifested whereby organizations were receiving criminal charges of money laundering or terrorism financing. That had several different types of impacts on organizations. First and foremost, if you're a small NGO and you're trying to carry out your election observation activities or your other good works, you're going to be distracted from that if you're being subpoenaed by the court to respond to the money laundering or terrorism financing charge that you're trying to do with. It also prompts a smear campaign whereby ill-intentioned states can advertise that NPO X or civil society group X is under investigation for money laundering. And what was really worrying here was that in cases where an organization has maybe received an acquittal, their charge has been dropped, that reputational damage seems to sustain much longer than the immediate effect of that charge or that investigation. Organizations have to do a lot of their own work after they've been acquitted to regain trust from their supporters or from donors even. The penultimate tactic.
Stephen, so sorry to interrupt. I think if your slides, if you can take them out of presenter mode so people can see them more clearly.
Oh no, I didn't know I was in presenter mode.
Sorry. We thought we were only seeing it because we're all panelists, but it turns out I think that it's everybody's seeing it this way. So if you don't mind.
Right.
Sorry to jump in so late. We thought it was just the panelist view.
That's okay. Well, now everyone can see my notes, which is it's fine.
There's nothing in there. Sneak peek and inside.
Yeah. Sneak peek.
Behind the scenes.
Just let me bring this back up in one moment.
So much.
Thanks, Ashley. How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, that looks great.
Now let me just go back to where I was. Nearly there. Okay. Politically motivated pretrial detention. For us, this kind of looked like the previous tactic, but just executed against individuals. Essentially, a problem whereby individuals that have been charged with money laundering or terrorism financing can remain in pretrial detention for a significant amount of time. And somebody can be charged with these crimes, terrorism financing or money laundering, without the deployment of any kind of significant evidence base. You just need suspicion of this type of illicit activity for an individual to end up sitting in pretrial detention for some time. Typically, these types of charges are based on very thin evidence, typically because the accused person hasn't actually convicted this crime. So the purpose is really to try and paralyze them or try to keep them in detention for as long as possible, knowing that eventually they'll have to be released. All the while, perhaps supporters of this individual, organizations that are a part of, draining their time and resources away from their core work to try and get their colleague out of jail. The final tactic is related to those FATF recommendations I spoke about that are connected to international information sharing. we've seen the FATF recommendations and some of the aspects that they underpin popping up in different types of international cooperation mechanisms, such as cross-border asset freezing orders, extradition requests, Interpol red notices, and other types of tools that rogue states will use to try and reach over international borders and suppress dissidents that are not even in the home country anymore. I think that poses interesting questions about the information sharing culture that we have in the anti-financial crime space, and whether we need to look a bit more closely in how we ensure access to information exchange internationally is balanced with protecting dissidents who have fled their home countries. This is essentially the highlights of the research. There are two publications, as was mentioned earlier. The one on the right is the Guide for Global Civil Society. I'd really encourage everyone in this webinar to look at that publication in particular. It includes not just those tactics I went through, but also different types of resistance tactics that we uncovered in our research, which we offer to civil society, which we think might be useful. They're certainly not recommendations on what we think CSOs and civil society should do should they become victim of this type of abuse, but they're at the very least offerings as to what's come before. So hopefully that's something that folks can learn from. And the publication on the left is our policy brief, which is very much directed at the Financial Action Task Force itself. We make several policy recommendations for how the FATF, as well as the Egmont group of FIUs, could undergo some reforms to try and stymie this type of abuse. Those are the top highlights I wanted to share right off the bat, but I'm really looking forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you, Stephen, for covering such a relevant subject, and especially for doing so on a global scale, which, as you mentioned, is a challenge in itself, but it's also very useful because we can also compare what's going on in different regions, find similarities, find differences, and see what can we do in the advocacy arena and resilience arena as well within civil society. Thank you very much. I just want to briefly give the floor to Azru Abbasova, also from the center, who will make a brief comment about dissemination of this study. Please, Azru, go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Miguel, and hi to everyone. I guess I'm here to jump in a little bit as well because Stephen has made an excellent presentation of what the research was about. Perhaps a few words on like how we've started to disseminate it for the group to get an idea and also like to see what further we can do. As Stephen very rightly mentioned, we at CFS or at RUSI, we're not an advocacy organization. So what we try to do is to produce an evidence-based research, which this research is exactly it. But the goal for this research is further for either policymakers to make some change and for the civil society to also, use it for further advocacy, for further, asking for the necessary changes. So I guess the research really provides some good both strategies and recommendations for that. But to give the audience a little bit of an idea on like what we've been trying to do and what we could do, which I would hope would come out as part of this discussion, particularly regarding the civil society, is that so we are trying to disseminate, put the word out there as much as we could. And this is done at mostly 3 levels. At the FATF level, we've been trying to engage with different, FATF stakeholders. We have had briefings and presentations at the regional plenaries of the regional style FATF bodies, which including the ones in the Caribbean, the ones in Eastern and Southern Africa and in West Africa, as well as we have had the briefings for the FATF heads of delegations. Since now I can say that the receipt of the research has been quite positive, and the FATF Secretariat itself recognizing that this is an important issue that they have to, focus on, and there has to be some kind of changes. And obviously, moving forward from the next mutual evaluation round, it is expected that there's going to be some more attention for the misuse of FATF standards. But that being said, there's still quite a lot of need for the push for ensuring that any kind of abuses are actually noted, and this affects the grades or the ratings that the countries get at the end. At the UN level, we've also briefed UN's Counterterrorism Compact Working Group on criminal justice, legal responses, and countering the financing of terrorism group, as well as we had a briefing for the experts. But I guess one of the key, key people who this research is for the civil society organizations, which is why we're here today as well. So my hope for the next part of the discussion is to hear from everyone to see, how further we can use the findings of this research and what, further activities we should be taking, or the civil society organizations can organize themselves to take as well. So I'll leave it here, but any questions or remarks, happy to jump in.
Thank you, Azru, very much. Very relevant that is disseminated in a very different array of factors that can take very serious learnings from this report. Related to the reports themselves, you can get a link either in the invitation that the Global Coalition sent, or I will ask my colleagues at the Global Coalition to share the links in the chat so you can all download both, check both links and get access to the report. Before going to the question and answers, I would just like to make a very brief comment about the relation with this situation that's highlighted in the report, or different situations, and our own situation in Latin America. In the Latin American region, we can see very clear examples on how does this operate in practice. There are, in most countries, these more subtle restrictions. Is the use of these recommendations turned into policies or practices, and then it is translated into restrictive actions against civil society. You can see, for example, that in Argentina or Chile, where indigenous movements are labeled as terrorist activities, or you can see in other countries where the burdens related to the administrative procedures or the obligations that civil society has related to finance of terrorism and even money laundering are sometimes overwhelming in terms of time, in terms of procedures, in terms of costs. Nevertheless, there are cases which are really, really worrying, and when you can see the full use of these procedures in order to tackle and even destroy civil society. And these are the cases of Nicaragua and Venezuela. Nicaragua is probably if it was a competition, it's hard to say which one is more extreme, but Nicaragua is an example on how the regulations are used to stigmatize and criminalize organizations on charges of either terrorist financing of terrorism activities. Under those assumptions, false assumptions, they have been able, the government of Nicaragua has been able to dismantle civil society by forcing out of existence more than 3,000 organizations. Some of them were openly opposed to the government and critical to the government or participating into a peaceful manifestation, but some other, the only sin you could say for the government was that they were NPOs. So we see organizations that had nothing to do with the political side or the political activism of civil society being dismantled. Their assets, they got confiscated, and the organizations just disappeared. Many of our colleagues, activists and colleagues from Nicaragua have gone to exile, Costa Rica, some in Mexico, the US, and they continue working there. But it's very clear how the same accusations around terrorism activities or terrorist financing has been used in order to destroy civil society. And the other case, which is very clear, and I recognize on what Stephen said, a very clear case is Venezuela. Venezuela is not only civil society, which there are very clear examples around human rights organizations being attacked or prosecuted, but also other types of actors, such as the political activists, journalists, human rights defenders, many different actors who participated in the protest, in the peaceful protest against the regime of Nicolas Maduro, especially after the elections held this year, that have been accused of terrorism activities. There's even a specialized counterterrorism court in Venezuela, in which these actors have been detained under false premises. Many of them have not had a fair trial, or if they have, has been totally biased against them. And more than 2,500 people are currently on detention in Venezuela after the elections that were clearly fraudulent from the current regime. And the final case we could highlight is El Salvador. El Salvador has been used accusations of terrorism activities against gang members. Many of the people detained, which are thousands now at this moment, one report points out that more than 5,000 people are presumed innocent to be held under false accusation of terrorism activities. So you can see in the reality what is going on. I mean, and this is just in one region and in 3 countries of the region, how on one side, civil society is practically destroyed, dismantled in one country, the case of Nicaragua. Second, how the activist and political participation against the regimes are imprisoned, are harassed, are criminalized. And third, also the use of these standards and translated into bad policies then can create a huge amount of prosecutions and violations of human rights, even when they are used against organized crimes and not specifically terrorism. So it's just a glimpse. It's just, let's say, a sample on what's going on, and the trend continues. So it's important to get to discuss what is happening around and what are we going to do with this, which is very relevant with Stephen say. It's now the turn of civil society to decide, okay, what can we do with this regarding advocacy, and what can we do with this related to building resilience in civil society and also the communities and all the activities and persons affected. Having said this, I would invite our attendees to pose their questions, please, to our guests. There's 2 ways to do this. Please feel free to write in the questions and answer. You have a small box over there, down on your right, and you can submit any questions you like. We'll be reading and answering this. And also, feel free to raise your hand as well. I cannot see them, but I will ask my colleagues if you can support me to give you the floor very briefly. To those who want to take the mic, I would just mention to be brief in order to continue. Okay, the links have already been shared. Thank you, Ashley, very much. You can see them in the chat box, and you can get both the report and the other publication, which is also there. And please feel free to pose your question. Ashley, I believe we can turn the recording off.